Hello everyone, my name is Siddhartha and I'm joined by my two classmates, Tanvi and Fariha. We recently studied the Industrial Revolution and its lasting effects on those who were involved. We found this to be a very intriguing and controversial topic, so we decided to sit down today and discuss some opposing views. We will go over four main points during this discussion. The first one is the idea of regimented working conditions and how these conditions and rules in factories affected the workers in both positive and negative ways. The next point is the shift in family structure that was caused by the Industrial Revolution and how that affected children and women specifically. We will then discuss the Industrial Revolution as it has been seen in popular literature. And lastly, we will talk about the long term effects of the Industrial Revolution on a physical as well as emotional level. So let's begin.
The disciplined working habits and continuous intensive use of capital equipment is the true essence of the Industrial Revolution. These regimented working conditions can be described as a shift in the distribution of labor force from the traditional highly seasoned occupations to a modern sector with its equipment and technology alongside labor.
Disclaimer: it is difficult to truly know the accuracy of the data that historians have provided with regards to the changes in standard of living. Different people interpret things in different ways. A sense of progress is very subjective and relative to the individual, so that perception is impossible to measure numerically.
So there are two sides to the standard of living debate. There are the pessimists who believe that the condition of the mass of working people deteriorated between 1780 and 1840, and then the optimists who believe a slow but perceptible improvement took place. Let's talk about the new levels of workplace discipline now. With the arrival of machines and time clock, new work habits were enforced. Working and resting hours were fixed. Entry and departure from factories were closely monitored, and everyone was accountable for their work. In some cases, arriving even 2 minutes late resulted in half an hour's wage being deducted. An inability to reproduce that product in that time meant that workers had to pay for that product themselves. These rules aimed to make work more predictable and less casual.
We've all heard of the proportional increase of the productive powers due to the division of labor by Adam Smith. That led to greater profits for factory owners and turned Britain into a wealthy nation. Division of labor increased the dexterity of each worker and reduced time wasted in passing work around and allowed machines to amplify their productivity.
Sure, some of these features of the Industrial Revolution benefited work, like machines could lighten labor and factories could provide social stimulation. But many workers found industrial working conditions a strain because they challenged a number of traditional values and habits.
Adding on, not to mention they spent up to 12 hours a day in poor working conditions in factories, with toxic materials, damp air, scorching temperatures, stinking gas, and dust flying around. All of this ultimately led to many physical illnesses. So any improvement of health from advances in standard of personal cleanliness was more than outweighed by the poor conditions in which they had to live and work in.
I'm going to read a first-hand interpretation of a miner describing the conditions they had to work in. A trembling of pupils forms in the eyes of many miners, and when it reaches a certain stage, they can no longer work in the pit. The miner becomes unsure of his grip and often misses objects by a foot. This calamity only appears in the mine and in artificial light, and above ground and in daylight. It is never present. Plus, almost all miners are anemic, probably from the long daily stay in bad air combined with the absence of sun or daylight. This causes burning foreheads, dizzy spells, and even paralyzes them beyond control or without being able to think.
However, the alternative was unemployment. Advancing technologies like that in cotton weaving displaced large groups of workers such as the handloom weavers. Cyclical unemployment caused by periodic booms and slumps were a depressing characteristic of factory work.
But the shifts eventually led to an upgrading of jobs. Most students would agree that the real sense of improvement among laboring classes thereafter was less due to the rise in wage rates, which remained relatively stable, but to the upgrading of laborers from very poorly paid to less poorly paid jobs, and above all, to a decline in employment or to a greater regularity of employment. This shift also created inequality. Unskilled and semi-skilled workers suffered the most. Skilled workers like engineers fared best. Worst off were agricultural laborers in the southern countries where alternative of factory work was not available.
So now we'll be moving on to our next point. We'll be talking about the shift in roles of children and women during the Industrial Revolution.
To begin with, let's focus on children specifically. The health of their children was a concern for mothers from the moment they were born, but there were two ends of the spectrum. While middle-class mothers worried about excess fat on their babies, working-class mothers aspired for babies with ample chins and chubby cheeks.
That's true. The divide was great, unfortunately. Only the most privileged boys experience a childhood without wants. For the vast majority of children, childhood, if it all existed, was effectively over by the age of 10. Beyond that age, and often earlier, children within the lower classes were required to contribute to the family income or to maintain themselves.
You're right. There was a drastic increase in the intensity of exploitation of child labor between 1780 and 1840, but the youngest age at which children were employed was 5 years old. Many argued that child labor was not a new development during the Industrial Revolution, as child labor was prevalent in the home or the family economy before that. It is also true that children were an important part of the agricultural and industrial economy even before 1780, until they began going to school. However, the intensity of this work within their families was nothing compared to what they would go on to do in the factories. There was a gradual introduction to work. It basically went from doing chores at home to a grueling factory work job.
I agree, they are not comparable. In contrast, children working in factories were treated very cruelly. When they made errors due to being fatigued, they would get beaten. And unlike the home, where work was scaled according to ability, factories meant the machinery dictated environment, discipline, speed, and regularity of work and working hours.
Yes, these factories really worked these children well. When local helping factories were slowing down, they even brought children from mental asylums and put them to work. One thing to note though, without the early and important contribution made by child labor, it is difficult to see how factory sector could have expanded at the pace and in the way that it did.
In fact, recruiting children from asylums isn't as surprising, given that many children were hired from orphanages. They were called parish apprentices, and aged as young as 7 or 8, were taken from their home in the parishes of London and transported to factories. On arrival, they would be piled up in dormitories, and their indentured lives as apprentices will continue until the age of 21. These parish apprentices were all poor and relied on welfare to survive, so the factory owners exploited them and put them to work.
And all this work had its effects. Working in factories affected children's physical state. Thousands died before even the age of 16, and those who survived were left deformed. Working in factories also affected children's morality. Children that were employed in mills generally misbehaved and acted out.
Still, I guess the times called for it. Once the opportunity became available, parents not only needed their children's saving, but expected them to work. This makes sense considering that over a third of the children appeared to have grown up in families without the steady support of a male head. When family incomes dropped, children were forced to become added workers.
But even though children were working their backs off, many of them still experienced a childhood reminiscent of hunger. In fact, Jane Humphrey, an author of childhood and child labor in the British Industrial Revolution, did a great job analyzing the autobiographies of over 600 working men who lived in the 18th and 19th century. One of them reminisced that he had hardly ever enough to eat and often grazed on whatever his rural environment offered, however unpalatable. Another child mentioned that his greatest meal was a cold mutton, some bread, and a jug of beer, and his worst, large number of rats, several of which I cooked and enjoyed. I guess it makes sense why so many children joined the workforce, to get rid of the hunger that was so pervasive in their everyday life.
There were also other factors that increased the participation rate of children in the workforce. Technology and division of labor created jobs that children could easily fill at a much lower pay, which definitely benefited the capitalists. Children were also more adaptable than men, and many machines were designed to be operated by the small fingers of children.
True. In fact, statistically speaking, the starting working age of children born between 1791 to 1850 was at an all-time low. The graph shown here charts the starting working age of children both in different years. Starting work was lower for boys born from 1791 to 1850 as opposed to any other years of the Industrial Revolution. In the sample as a whole, mean age at starting work first declined and then increased over time, falling from 11.5 in the first cohort to 10.28 and 9.98 in the middle cohorts, before rising again to 11.39 in the final cohort. By the age of 15, work was almost universal in all cohorts, but there were dramatic differences over time in the proportions working at younger ages. Very young working was rare in the first and fourth cohort, but much more common in the middle period.
So now that we've discussed the children, let's move on to the second part of this topic, and we'll talk about the women involved in the Industrial Revolution. So women's roles in public and private spheres also underwent a transformation during this revolution, from participating in the cottage industry to joining the labor workforce and then subsequently retreating to the household. The dynamic roles played by women were affected by their living conditions and living influences of the Industrial Revolution.
Before the start of the Industrial Revolution, the cottage industry, which means the manufacturing activities were done in homes, was prevalent in Britain. Women would bake all the necessary commodities at home and trade those items locally for other necessities. Mothers also gathered their children to help with production activities that created an economic subsystem within the household. As time went on, the focus from producing the goods and services for direct consumption shifted towards marketed goods. This shift changed people's attitude towards work. They worked now to fulfill their wants. As a result, women went out to work to earn enough money to buy the commodities that were newly available in the market and preferred instead of homemade goods.
On top of this, many women also went out to earn extra income for the family, or in other cases without a husband, became the main source of income. Women's participation rate in the workforce varied according to their husbands' occupations and financial situations. Soldiers and casual workers were some of the lowest paid and least reliable male workers, so their wives had higher participation rates in the workforce. Most work paid mothers very little. While trying to juggle domestic work and childcare, mothers often got trapped into doing marginal and badly paid jobs.
There was a variety of work that women participated in, but the most notable was their mass participation in factory work. Women were hired easily as employers valued their obedience and willingness to learn, as well as they required lower wages than men. While this benefited the employers, life for female workers was not easy. The impact of their work on their health is captured in this quote by a female worker.
Makes my feet ache and swells to stand so much. Almost all say that when they have worked here a year or two, they have to procure shoes a size or two larger than before they came.
This goes to show the physical toll that they had to endure in these factories.
Another important topic was the involvement of pregnant women in the workforce. Even pregnant working mothers weren't spared the agony of working under such grueling conditions to earn a living. Many mothers worked until the last weeks of their pregnancy and returned to work less than 3 weeks after birth for fear of losing their employment. In the absence of proper childcare, many new mothers brought their infants to work. This might not have directly led to infant death, but the mortality of children of workers can be linked to poor health conditions of those in factories and workplaces.
Similarly, another group of women who are often overlooked when studying the impact of the Industrial Revolution are prostitutes. The Industrial Revolution actually boosted the number of prostitutes because it offered them an opportunity to earn a living as well as gain economic independence. A quote reads, "If the woman of the family worked as a prostitute, there likely would have been a very substantial increase in the family's income." Now you might be wondering why women would choose to become prostitutes for work rather than working at a factory. Well, we've already discussed some of the hardships that women had to face working in these factories, such as long hours, unsafe work environment, and long-term physical injuries. So based on that, it was actually safer to become a prostitute than a factory worker. However, prostitutes did risk contracting STDs, but the Contagious Disease Act of 1864 attempted to protect these women by examining them every year to ensure they were clean and free from any diseases. It was actually discovered during these tests that female prostitutes were often more cleaner than those women that actually worked in the factory.
I totally understand what you're saying. I once read a play called Mrs. Warren's Profession, where a prostitute mother was trying to justify to her modern educated daughter why she went into prostitution in the first place. Mrs. Warren witnessed one of her sisters die of lead poisoning while being overworked at factory. Another one of her sister was well off being married to a rich governor until he took to drinking. Mrs. Warren worked as a waiter, but the physical impact of the work wore her down until she turned to prostitution, earned enough to save money, and then started her own business. As a result, she was able to become an independent woman who could afford a first-class education for her daughter. I guess stories like Mrs. Warren's are true of that time.
Moving on, let's talk about how women ended up leaving the factories and coming back home. The mid-industrial revolution period was marked by women's participation in the workforce, but by the end of the century, women were retreating back home because a different kind of demand started arising. By the 1850s, men started earning more money, so women and children went back to the household. And at this point, the breadwinner homemaker household idea became widespread. Household consumption patterns began to change. With a rise in income, the demand for commodities associated with hygiene and nutrition, the health and education of children increased. Some even claim that this productive household system was responsible for lower morbidity and mortality, better nutrition, and higher education levels towards the end of the century.
So now we'll be moving on to our next point, which revolves around the Industrial Revolution in popular literature. Popular culture, such as literature and art, started telling stories of these abuse and pathetic living conditions. One popular example would be Hard Times by Charles Dickens, where through his writing he critiques the effects of work on factory workers and the state of education in the era of the Industrial Revolution.
Dickens was an Oliver Twist in real life, as he worked as a child labor in his early years. I guess that's why he was very sympathetic towards the plight of the working class people. Dickens critiqued how industrialization was turning men into machines and all for economic growth. He wanted to show that the English factory worker lived a life of grinding poverty and deprivation, shut out from amusement and relaxation by long working hours and restrictive laws.
Dickens was very unhappy with the intense focus on facts in education as opposed to creativity and free thinking. The heartless scientific education of his times did not fit Dickens' moral vision of an ideal society.
Many say of Dickens that he could not understand the proletariat plight as he was not working amongst them. How would it be possible that he work and write, as a mine worker said? It truly takes spiritual magnitude to occupy still oneself with belletristic, scientific, and thought-provoking materials after a completed shift, as there only remains the evening hours for the writing tasks which I deem noble.
There are many great authors that have written on the topic of the Industrial Revolution with varying perspectives. The poets saw things that economists didn't, and vice versa, and the purpose of these novels was to awaken the conscience of the ruling class to their responsibility towards improving the conditions of the poor so that the nation may reunite in common purpose. So, let's take a look at some of the most interesting cases.
Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx said that working class people and their bosses would come into inevitable conflict, and from the clash of classes there would emerge a classless or communistic society.
Arnold Toynbee, in Lectures of the Industrial Revolution, believed that the effects of the Industrial Revolution prove that free competition may produce wealth without well-being.
J. Allen B. Hammond, in The Rise of Modern Industry, once said that everything turned to profit. The new factories and the new furnaces were like pyramids, telling of man's enslavement rather than his power, casting their shadow over the society that took such pride in them.
With regards to the standard of living during the Industrial Revolution, E.J. Hobsbawm believed that it is entirely illegitimate to reject the 500,000 or more handloom weavers of 1830 or the army of seamstresses. Poverty and dirt alone are not the issue. The change from one way of life to another is equally at stake.
So, as you all can see, we have many different opinions about the Industrial Revolution from many different people. Some saw the Industrial Revolution as a positive based on the human race evolving, and some were focused on the hardships and cruelty that took place in order to get these advancements. Overall, there were some interesting and compelling arguments from both sides.
Now lastly, we will be talking about the long-term effects, lasting effects of the Industrial Revolution. There are many long-term effects of the Industrial Revolution which extended beyond the current generation. An interesting one is the decrease in physical stature occurred earlier in Europe, coinciding with the onset of Industrial Revolution. Downswings in physical stature was linked to economic forces such as the rise in income equality, increase in relative food prices, increased variability of income, urbanization, and industrialization.
As we know, the poor died younger. There was a big difference in the life expectancy of the upper and lower income groups during this period. Not only that, the poor actually grew shorter. The first reason is due to an increase in relative price of nutrients, partly because technological change and capital accumulation in agriculture was slower than in industry, but also because of diminishing returns to labor in food production. Food prices in Britain rose by 66% between 1770 and 1795. The lower middle class needed to substitute industrial commodities for food products and within the food budget itself by substituting carbohydrates for protein-rich food. This in turn affected the way they grew.
Population growth also contributed to the deterioration in nutritional status because of diminishing returns to labor in the agricultural sector, particularly in Europe, where the opportunities for expansion of arable land were quite limited. A comparison is with adult male slaves in America, where prices of food increased at the same rate, but the increase in slave prices relative to the price of food by 64% provided an incentive for the slave owners not only to maintain but to increase the nutritional status of their slaves so the slaves were more healthy.
Due to industrialization, the increased division of labor, and more advanced transportation, farmers were able to sell their products easily. Lacking the full knowledge of the technology of health production, they traded away proteins, minerals, vitamins essential to the health and nutrition of the children. Although such producers gained from the transactions in monetary terms, the children became stunted and less healthy as a consequence.
Increases in population density fostered the transmission of diseases. Potentially, The increased trade associated with improved transportation, market integration, urbanization, and industrialization did so as well. Sickness took up nutrients. However, these sicknesses affected both the rich and the poor.
Town dwellers were generally at a disadvantage for procuring nutrients because they were farther away from the source of food supply. Until the invention of refrigerated railroad cars and ships, transportation technology was not sufficiently advanced to accommodate the shipment of milk and fresh meat over long distances.
Children worked more and expended more energy, but weren't more and more capable of accumulating additional calories and in turn increased their nutritional status. But while one would expect that heights would have been increased in Britain by the 1830s in response to the factory laws of 1832, which limited the extent of child labor and reduced the number of hours worked, they did not.
In some ways, the common men and women of early industrial age were not as well off as their parents. The gain in income achieved by modern economic growth in the early industrial period was simply too low to offset declines in health. Childhood nourishment had the health implication over the course of a lifetime. Many years later, as they aged, they suffered more from rheumatism, hernias, hemorrhoids, respiratory problems than prior generations.
So, in conclusion, all of these economic, productivity, agricultural, and nutritional aspects led to the decrease in heights of majority the poor over generations to come. So, we talked about a lot of things here, from working conditions to women and children to popular literature, and finally the lasting effects of the Industrial Revolution on future generations. So, what do you guys think? Do you still think that there's effects of the Industrial Revolution in today's society?
Well, I think in terms of the regimented working conditions, it's still in effect, especially in, let's say, sweatshops where the workers are abused, work long hours, and sometimes they're even banned from going out during working hours. So this is very similar to the factory rules that existed in Britain at that time.
That's true, and moreover, the shift away from the cotton industry and moving into the division of labor and the factory style of producing goods is the reason we have all the products that we have here today.
And that brings us to the end of our podcast. So thank you guys for listening, and have a great day.